My mother-in-law waited until the good china was on the table. And everyone had wine in hand before she made her move. She'd chosen Thanksgiving because she knew I'd be too gracious to cause a scene in her house, on her holiday, in front of her people. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about a lot of things. Starting with who actually owned the company she'd been trying to take from me for the past 2 years. I'm going to tell you what happened that November. But I need to back up first. Because none of it makes sense without understanding what I'd built and what they thought they were taking. I started Meridian Design Group in 2016, out of a rented carriage house in East Nashville that smelled like cedar and old motor oil. I was 32, newly licensed as a landscape architect, and I had $11,000 in savings, a truck I'd inherited from my grandfather, and a client list that fit on one index card. My great-aunt had left me a modest inheritance when I was 24. Enough to pay for my master's degree and still have something left over. And I'd watched that money carefully for 8 years before I spent a single dollar of it on the business. By the time I met my husband at a design conference, in 2018, Meridian had 19 employees and 2 contracts with a major commercial real estate developer in Brentwood. By the time we married in 2019, we had 31 employees, a second location in Chattanooga, and annual revenue that would have made 24-year-old me cry in disbelief. My attorney drafted a prenuptial agreement that my husband signed without independent counsel of his own, because he said he trusted me, and because at the time, I believed he meant it. My mother-in-law gave a toast at our rehearsal dinner that I still think about. She raised her glass and said she was so happy her son had finally found someone with ambition. She said it the way you'd compliment a horse's gait, admiring the function, not particularly invested in the animal. I should have listened to that toast. For the first 2 years the condescension was subtle enough that I could tell myself I was imagining it. A comment at Christmas, about how Meridian's growth might plateau, without stronger executive infrastructure. An offhand suggestion at Easter that a male co-founder might give the firm more credibility with certain clients. My husband would go quiet during these moments. Not disagreeing. Just quiet. The shift happened around month 20 of our marriage, and it happened gradually, the way most important things do. My husband started spending more time at his parents' house in Brentwood. He started using phrases I recognized as his mother's. At a certain scale, institutional knowledge, long-term sustainability. He started asking to review the firm's financials, framing it as wanting to feel connected to my work. I let him see some things. Not everything, because I had grown up watching my father run a hardware business he'd built with his own hands, and my father always said, "The people who want to understand your numbers are the people who want to control your outcomes." I started keeping a second file, 8 months before Thanksgiving. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment of revelation, just a slow accumulation of small signals. A credit card charge for dinner at a restaurant my husband claimed he'd never been to. A hotel reservation under our joint American Express that didn't match any trip I knew about. His phone face down on the table in a way it had never been before. The way his mother began referencing transition plans in conversation, as though I were a CEO being packaged out of a company I'd founded. My best friend Robin is a CPA who specializes in forensic accounting, and she was the first person I told. We'd been friends since graduate school, and she had a particular gift for looking at financial documents, the way I looked at a site survey, finding the patterns that told you something was structurally wrong. She came over one Saturday morning, in late September, with her laptop and a thermos of coffee, and we spent 4 hours going through everything I'd quietly assembled. At the end of those 4 hours, she closed her laptop and looked at me very steadily. "They're not being careless," she said. "They're being systematic." I called my attorney the following Monday. The firm's operating agreement, which I had written with counsel back in 2016, contained a clause I'd included almost as an afterthought. Any change in management or ownership structure required a unanimous vote of all members. I was the only member. My husband had never been added to the operating agreement. He had no standing, neither did his mother. My prenuptial agreement, which my attorney had drafted with the specificity of someone who anticipated exactly this scenario, excluded all premarital business assets from marital property. It also excluded any appreciation on those assets, which had been a sticking point before signing. My husband had signed it anyway. I thought that meant he was secure in himself. I now understood it. Meant he expected the agreement to never matter. There was one more thing. The studio where Meridian operated. A converted warehouse in the Wedgwood, Houston neighborhood that I'd fallen in love with on site. Did not belong to the company. It belonged to a family trust established by my great-aunt before her death, with me as the sole beneficiary. The trust leased the building to Meridian at below market rate. The lease came up for renewal January 1st. I had not signed the renewal documents yet. These were the 3 things I knew. I did not share them with anyone except Robin and my attorney. I sat with this knowledge for 6 weeks. I went to family dinners. I smiled, and I helped my mother-in-law set the table. And I watched her grow more comfortable in the certainty that she had already won. She brought the other woman to Thanksgiving. Her name was Francesca. My mother-in-law introduced her as a brilliant young woman from their church community. Wharton MBA, background in operations management. A real estate developer father, who apparently ran in the same circles as the in-laws. Francesca was 28 and looked like someone who had been very carefully prepared for this exact moment. She wore the kind of dress that communicated seriousness without being frumpy. Her handshake was firm. Her eye contact was calibrated. She sat in the chair to my husband's left. No one looked surprised by this. Not my husband. Not his father. Not his younger brother, who usually at least had the decency to look uncomfortable during these productions. My mother-in-law waited until the second course. "I've been talking with Francesca about Meridian," she said with the pleasantness of someone announcing a pie-baking winner at a county fair. "I think she'd be an exceptional fit for the executive director role during the..." She paused, selecting her word. "Transition." The table went quiet in the particular way. Tables go quiet when everyone knows something is happening, but no one wants to name it. I set down my fork. I picked up my water glass. I took one very deliberate sip. "What transition is that?" I asked. My mother-in-law smiled. "Well, given everything that's been happening, we thought it might be best if you had some time to focus on yourself. Francesca has real operational experience. She could keep things running smoothly while you..." "While I what?" The smile didn't move. Step back. I looked at Francesca, who had the grace to appear slightly uncomfortable. "Do you have experience in landscape architecture specifically?" I asked her. "No," she said, "but operational management translates across." "I'm sure it does." I turned back to my mother-in-law. "I'm curious about something. When you picture this transition, Francesca stepping in as executive director, whose signature do you imagine on the authorization documents?" A flicker of something crossed her face. "Because I ask," I continued, "because Meridian Design Group is a single-member LLC. I am the only member. Any change to management structure requires my written consent under the operating agreement. My husband," I looked at him sitting very still to my right, "has no standing in the company. He never has. He never signed onto the operating agreement, and he is explicitly excluded from business assets under our prenuptial agreement. Section 12, if you'd like the specific language." The silence was different now. "The firm is mine," I said. "It was mine when I married your son. It will be mine when this conversation is over. And the building where we operate, that belongs to my family's trust. The lease comes up in 7 weeks. I haven't decided yet whether to renew it." Francesca picked up her wine glass and then seemed to think better of it and set it down again. "Now." I folded my napkin and placed it on the table. "Is there anything else you'd like to discuss, or should we move on to dessert?" My mother-in-law found her voice first. She said something about lawyers and agreements, and how this wasn't how families handled things. My husband said nothing. He sat looking at his plate, with the expression of a man who had committed himself to a course of action, and was only now understanding its full weight. Francesca said. "She thought she should probably go." I said quietly that I thought that was a good idea. I stayed for another 40 minutes. I helped clear the plates, because I was raised to help clear the plates. I accepted a slice of pumpkin pie. I sat in the living room and listened to football I had no interest in, and when it felt like an appropriate time to leave, I stood up and said I had an early morning. In the driveway, my husband caught up with me. "We need to talk about this," he said. "I had your things moved to the Marriott on West End," I said. "The suite is paid through the weekend. After that, you'll need to make your own arrangements." I paused. "I filed for separation this morning before we drove out here. My attorney will be in touch with yours." I had known I would file that morning. I had the paperwork ready the week before. I had simply been waiting to see if I was wrong about everything. If there was some version of events where this dinner was not what I'd been watching it become. For 8 months. There wasn't. The drive home took 40 minutes. I played no music. I let the interstate feel like the interstate, wide and dark and indifferent, and by the time I pulled into my own driveway I had cried exactly once briefly and then stopped. Robin came over that night. She'd been waiting for my text, which I'd sent from the driveway. It happened. Come over whenever. She arrived with Vietnamese takeout and a flash drive, and sat across from me at my kitchen table while I told her everything. She took notes in her small, precise handwriting, and asked clarifying questions with the focus of someone who has been preparing for a deposition. "The credit cards," she said. "I want to look at everything from March forward." The picture that emerged over the next 3 hours was not surprising. But it was clarifying. Beginning in March, my husband had made a series of purchases corresponding to a pattern Robin recognized immediately: hotel rooms on Tuesday and Thursday evenings at a property near the Vanderbilt campus. Restaurant charges for two. Always at places he'd never mentioned to me. A jewelry purchase in April for $2,400 at a boutique whose clientele was approximately 30 years younger than me. He had no access to Meridian accounts. Whatever he and his mother had planned for the firm, the financial manipulation existed elsewhere. In the story they would tell, the pressure they would apply, the version of events they would construct in which I was overwhelmed, or incapable, or simply agreeable enough to step aside. "He thought the prenup wouldn't hold," Robin said. "Or he thought I'd never use it." She nodded slowly. "Same outcome." My office manager, Harper, had been with Meridian for 5 years. She was 27. Organized in the way that looks effortless but costs you everything, and she had been watching something that made her uncomfortable long enough that she'd started writing things down. She knocked on my office door the Monday after Thanksgiving, and closed it behind her. "I need to show you something," she said. Over the preceding 4 months, my husband had visited the Meridian offices 11 times. On 4 of those visits, Harper had observed him photographing documents on my desk: client contracts, project timelines, our contractor rate sheets. On 2 occasions he had attempted to access my filing system using a key he'd somehow obtained to the outer office door. He hadn't had the code to my private office, but he'd tried. Harper had documented all of it. Dates, times, what she'd observed, photographs she'd taken on her phone. She'd been quiet because she wasn't certain what she was seeing, and she was 27, and he was my husband. "I almost didn't say anything," she said. She looked at her hands. "But when I heard you'd filed, I thought you should have everything." I looked at her across my desk and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was clenched. "Thank you," I said. "This matters more than you know." My attorney filed the operating agreement documentation with the court before my mother-in-law's lawyer could move on anything. The emergency injunction my husband's team attempted, claiming I was engaged in willful dissipation of marital assets by threatening to let the building lease lapse, failed at the first hearing. The judge took approximately 8 minutes to review the operating agreement and the prenup, before ruling that there were no marital assets at issue. My mother-in-law called me directly twice the week after the hearing. I did not answer. My attorney responded in writing. Then something I hadn't expected. Francesca reached out by email, using an address not connected to any account I'd seen. She said she had not known the full picture when she was first approached, that she'd been told the transition was already agreed upon, that I was stepping back voluntarily for health reasons, that the role was legitimate. She attached documentation. Text messages between my husband and his mother from June, laying out their sequence of events. A note from my mother-in-law to Francesca explicitly stating that the firm would be restructured once the divorce was finalized. A reference to a conversation with a real estate contact about breaking the building lease, which was legally impossible without my family trust's consent, but which they had apparently not fully understood. I forwarded everything to my attorney. I won't pretend that seeing the full architecture of it was easy. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from discovering how long something was planned, how many people had known, how much of your ordinary life had been running alongside. This other thing you didn't know was there. My husband and I had gone to his cousin's wedding in June. We'd stayed in a hotel in Savannah, eaten shrimp and grits, danced to a band that was slightly too loud. I had thought that was a good weekend. I had thought we were fine. He'd been planning this since before Savannah. I took 2 sessions a week with my therapist throughout this period, which was the most practical decision I made all fall. I did not process my grief in ways that would compromise my legal position. I did not send emails I would regret. I showed up to my office every single day. The divorce proceedings took 4 months. Hotel surveillance footage showing my husband in the lobby with Francesca, on dates corresponding to charges from our joint account, was not pleasant to sit through. My attorney presented it without editorializing. The documentation of 11 unauthorized office visits was entered into the record. The text messages Francesca had provided were authenticated. My husband's attorney argued the prenuptial agreement had been signed under duress, a claim that collapsed under questioning. Because the signing had occurred 6 months before the wedding, he had been encouraged to seek independent counsel, and he had chosen not to. The judge granted the divorce on fault grounds: adultery. The damage award, $800,000 for intentional infliction of emotional distress, was not something I had anticipated, but my attorney was not surprised. My mother-in-law sat in the gallery for 2 days and then stopped coming. I signed the lease renewal on the studio building on January 3rd. Meridian's new fiscal year started strong. I hired 2 senior landscape architects I'd been trying to recruit for 18 months. I restructured the Chattanooga office under a director I'd been developing for 2 years. A woman named Zara, who had come to us straight out of Tennessee State, and had been doing the work of that title long before she held it. I told her that during the promotion conversation, and she said she knew, and then she laughed, and then so did I. Harper got a raise that I should have given her 6 months earlier. I told her that plainly, and she said she'd been patient, and something in the way she said it made me think she was talking about more than just the salary. Robin took me to dinner at a small Italian place in Germantown on the 1-year anniversary of that Thanksgiving. We split a bottle of Barolo and she gave me a card that said on the front, "To the most prepared person I know," and inside, in her small precise handwriting, "I knew you'd be okay. I just wanted you to know that I knew." I kept the card on my desk for the rest of the winter. There's a version of this story where I frame what happened as a war I won. I understand why that framing is satisfying. The opposition was real, the threat was real, and yes, I want to be clear. They lost. The injunction failed. The divorce was granted. The firm remains mine, has always been mine, will continue to be mine. My mother-in-law sits in a house in Brentwood with considerably less social currency than she had before. Because these stories get out the way they always do. And the circles she cared about are not particularly forgiving of public embarrassment. But I don't think of it as winning a war, because wars require enemies, and what I actually had was a marriage that turned into something other than what I believed it was. That's a different kind of loss. Winning against it doesn't undo the loss. It just means you don't also lose the business. What I think about more now is the woman who stood in her mother-in-law's driveway on a November night and drove home alone on the interstate without any music. She already knew, by then, that she was going to be all right. She'd known that for months. She'd built all the scaffolding before she needed to stand on it. But knowing you're going to be all right isn't the same as not being sad about it. I planted a dogwood tree in my backyard this spring. I chose it because my grandmother had one, and because they bloom in April, and because I wanted something alive in my yard that I had selected entirely for myself, with no input from anyone. It's doing well. If any part of this felt familiar, If you've ever built something with your own hands and watched someone circle it like they had a claim on it, I want you to know this. The documentation you're keeping matters. The attorney you call matters. The friend who will sit at your kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a holiday night and help you read the numbers. She matters most of all. You don't have to be loud to be protected. You just have to be ready.